Hey everybody, welcome back. Hope you've enjoyed the last few videos if you've watched those. So far on the channel, we've gone over input gain staging, we've talked about EQ, we've talked about compression, and that leads nicely into today's video, which is expanders and gates. If you've already watched the video on compression, great job. If you haven't, it might be worth watching that video first because a lot of the terminology we're going to use and the types of controls that we're going to cover carries over from compression. So if you have watched it, awesome. If you haven't, you can still watch, but you'd probably get more out of it if you did check that video out first. So let's talk about expanders and gates. What are they? What do they do? What are the controls? And what are some practical applications? With a compressor, we had discussed that the goal of a compressor is to reduce the dynamic range of signal that's coming into it, taking the highs, making them not as high, and then we can also take the lows and bring them up a little bit. With expanders and gates, the goal is to expand the dynamic range of the signal that's coming in. And the way that works, you can think of it like a compressor that's upside down. The threshold on a compressor is going to measure all the signal that's coming in. And when that signal gets above the set threshold, that's when the gain reduction unit activates and it starts bringing that level down to whatever the ratio is that you specified on the ratio knob on the compressor. A gate is going to work in a similar way. However, rather than signal going above a threshold being reduced, it's going to be signal that is below a threshold that is being reduced. How much you reduce it depends on what your setting is, but that's the general idea. You might be thinking, okay, well, where are some applications for that? That sounds kind of odd. And there's a ton of applications. The two most common ones, in my experience, are for drum kit to prevent what's called bleeding across microphones. To give you an example of that, if you are miking up a snare drum, for instance, that microphone doesn't know, okay, your job is to pick up snare drum and only snare drum. It's going to pick up whatever else happens to be loud enough to be picked up by it. The snare drum's going to be the loudest if you have it mic'd properly and you have it, facing the drum, but there's still going to be other elements of the drum kit or whatever happens to be going on around the drum kit that bleed into that microphone. So that's one of the things that we cover with that. The other thing the other place that I see gates getting used pretty frequently is with vocals, specifically in live audio applications. If you have a situation where, the mics need to be on all the time, but there may be a little bit of space in between any individual singing, a gate can help reduce some of that background noise. It's possible that you can work yourself into some pickles with that, though. We'll talk about, different applications for that as we go along. But those are the two most frequent applications. So without further ado, let's just jump right into it and see how we get to use compressors on a drum kit specifically first. I have open here in Pro Tools a recording session from a live band that was taken a few months back. And I've isolated just the drum kit here. Let's take a listen to that and see what it sounds like. This is no EQ, no compression, no gating at this point. There's a little bit of phase alignment that's been done to it. But by and large, everything is pretty much untreated. Let's see what it sounds like. So already in there, you can hear that there's a little bit of bass guitar, there's a little bit of crowd noise, but let's zone in just on the snare drum mic for one moment. So you can hear there, even though our goal with this microphone is to only pick up the snare drum, we're still getting a little bit of kick drum, we're getting a little bit of hi-hats, and just some other ambient noise that is coming in through that microphone. So this is where we can really apply gates to be able to reduce some of that bleeding. I'm going to use one of my favorite gates. If you're on a mixing console and you're doing live audio, you're just going to have one gate available to you. If you are doing recorded audio, you're probably going to have more options available to you, but they all work the same way, in the same manner that a compressor would work. Sometimes you'll have controls available, sometimes controls will not be available, but they all do the same thing. Pardon me. So let's set our threshold first. We can see that the snare drum signal that's coming in, let's go to input, it's peaking out somewhere between 10 and 15, so I probably don't want to have the snare drum set up, or the threshold set above that on the snare drum, because then I could be affecting the actual drum. So let's go a little bit below that. Let's say everything, let's go about -20 as a starting point. And yes, this is DBFS. This is a different meter, but just for a starting point. Okay, so nothing's happened. That's because we don't have the range adjusted yet. We've just set the threshold. As I adjust the range knob is going to be how far in terms of dB that signal gets reduced once it goes below the threshold. So if I have it set to 10, you can anticipate, and we can see it on this light here, this shows the amount of reduction in real time. We can anticipate that there's going to be 10 dB of reduction whenever the signal drops below that threshold. Let's see what that sounds like. We can already kind of hear it, you know, squashing things down. Let's set the threshold just a little bit higher so that we catch more of the bleed and see if we can eliminate more of the background noise. That sounds better already. Let's bypass it and see how it sounds. And here it is with it in. So a noticeable difference right away, not quite where we wanted, but a noticeable difference right away. Let's take that range and turn it up to 40. That's going to be 40 dB of reduction. So we can still hear some of the transients, the snap of that kick coming through. So I'll adjust my threshold up a little bit and see how that affects it. So that's quite a bit more reduction. We still have some ambient noise coming through, but that's because this is currently not set to gate mode. So let's take a moment to talk about the difference between an expander and a gate. It's the amount of reduction. Really, that's it. When you have it set in gate mode, or if you're gating something, you're pretty much cutting out everything below the threshold, so it's the maximum amount of reduction. Let's see what turning this gate button on does. Here it is off. And on. Off. And on. So noticeable right away. Now we can go in and adjust our threshold a little bit more to get just the last of that kick drum out. Okay, that's pretty good. We can hear a little bit of the kick drum every now and then, but for the most part, we've effectively eliminated the kick drum and the snare drum, or the hi-hat bleed in the snare drum mic. Now, you might be noticing that, okay, yeah, you're reducing that, but the snare drum sounds really choppy. Is that how it's going to sound all the time? Well, if you don't adjust the release, it is. So what the release is going to do is it's going to determine, once that audio has dipped back below the threshold, how long it takes for the gate to close again. So if you have it set to a fast release, that means as soon as the audio drops below the threshold, it's just going to snap shut, and then it's going to be much more jagged sounding, for lack of a better phrase. Let's listen to the release all the way down, the fastest possible setting on this. Not great sounding. It's super, super short release. Now, let's adjust that up to where we get more of the actual tone of the drum and then have the gate close just past that. And this is something that takes a little bit of time to work with in any situation, live audio, recorded audio, but getting the release just right really helps. There we go. So now we've got the full tone of the drum and you know, most of the resonance after the fact. Yeah, we can hear a little bit of hi-hat now and a little bit of kick drum, but for the most part, and I'm going to bypass it in a second so you can hear the difference, it sounds about 1,000 times better. So here's no gate at all. Here's with the gate on. So, already better. I think we can make it just a little bit crisper though. The last thing that I'll draw your attention to is this attack switch. A lot of gates, you'll see an attack knob. On this one, similar to the compressor on this specific plugin, you get two options for attack. You have a predetermined attack time that the manufacturer has baked into it, and you can choose between a fast attack and a slow attack. In general, 30 milliseconds or smaller is going to be fast attack on a compressor or a gate, and then longer than 30 milliseconds is going to be a long attack. We had this originally set up for long attack. That means once the audio comes above the threshold, that's how long it takes the gate to open up. So let's listen to that, and then let's turn it to fast attack and see how it goes. This is slow attack. Now we'll do fast attack. So a very subtle difference. In one of those settings, the transient gets clipped off just a tiny bit as a result of the gate opening in the middle of that transient waveform. But for the most part, they're pretty similar. I prefer fast attack, but use your ears. Find out what works for you. So let's A-B that one more time. We're going to do no gate and then a gate. Here's the gate all the way off. And on. So a pretty dramatic difference right off the bat. Now you might be thinking, okay, well, what's the point of eliminating some of that bleed? Don't you want kind of a good picture of the whole drum kit? And to a certain point, yeah, you'd be correct. However, the more bleed that comes in, if you think you're raising the overall noise floor that's coming in, you can run into issues where changes in EQ or compression adversely affects other instruments that are bleeding into it. What you find frequently with snare drum is that changes to EQ and compression can affect hi-hat that's bleeding into it, and as a result, yeah, your snare drum might sound really good, but your hi-hat sounds awful because not only do you have the microphone on your hi-hat that you are adjusting, but also the hi-hat that's bleeding in through the snare drum. The second reason for that is going to be, pardon me, the punchiness of the drums. If the noise floor is raised, that impact doesn't really cut through quite as much as something that is completely silent and then comes out and hits you in the face with audio. So that's some of the reasons. Again, there's the application for gates and expanders are many. We're just kind of covering what each component does and a basic setup for that. For that matter, as we discussed, depending on what your situation is, you may have some or all of these controls available to you. Let's do the same process with a different gate plugin just to show that, okay, it's not really just specific to this. All these concepts carry over. So let's go to Dynamics, and I'm just going to pick a random gate. Let's do our C1 gate, and I'm going to add in the kick drum now. Let's listen to that without a gate. There's actually a good degree of isolation, but we can hear a little bit of the snare drum in there. So let's see if we can get rid of that. First thing I'm going to do to examine my audio here. And it looks like in this area, we'll call it -30 is where we really get most of that kick drum. So I'm going to adjust this to about -30. Okay, that's a lot of gain reduction already. It's just the kick drum, but if you'll notice, the kick drum doesn't sound quite as good as it once did. That's because we need to go in and adjust the attack, the release, and potentially the hold. The hold is just going to be how long the gate is held open before it starts releasing. So we're not going to mess with the floor. That really will just change it into more of an expander. So let's just fiddle around here and see what we can come up with. So I think I'm going to lower the threshold a little bit. Okay, that's better. It's a little bit faster attack. Okay, now we've got that snap, but I want a little bit more of that ring, so I'm going to increase the release time. Cool. To me, that sounds better. Let's bypass that and see if it actually does sound better. I'll turn it up a little bit so you can hear. That's off. Let's turn it on. Cool. Yeah, I think that sounds better than it did previously. And when you put that into context, again, this may not seem like it makes a huge difference, but when we put it back into context with the drum kit, I'm going to turn these off first. And let's listen to how it sounds without gating and with. Without. So again, subtle but noticeable difference. And that's really all there is to gating. A very simple but a very effective tool. One piece of advice I will offer to you if you're looking to do this on vocals, you want to make sure that you are very, very deliberate with how you set the threshold on the gate. If you have that threshold set too high, then you could have the gate activating in the middle of somebody's singing or speaking if you're doing a play or spoken word engagement. So you want to be very careful about that. And then also the attack and the release time. If you have a very quick release time set up and somebody happens to get much softer and you haven't watched the threshold on that, then it's possible that gate could snap shut in the middle of their speech. So you want to be very deliberate with that and make sure that you're taking your time during sound check and setting those up correctly. So that's our intro to expanders and gates. Really hope you enjoyed the video. If you have any questions, leave them down in the comments below, and we'll see you in the next one. See you.